The silence of the void was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a crushing, absolute pressure that pushed against the hull of the Ethelgard. Across the expanse of the sector, they waited, 400 warships, a blockade of obsidian and cold, calculated geometry. They were the Xylanth, beings who processed the universe as a series of equations, their vessels shaped like jagged needles designed to stitch the fabric of reality into their own image. They did not understand art, they did not understand defiance, and they certainly did not understand the Pale Architects. Inside the bridge of the Ethelgard, Commander Elias Thorne stood before the primary display. The screen didn't show stars, it showed ripples in the darkness. Those ripples were the Xylanth fleet. They had been there for 3 solar cycles, broadcasting a single, looping signal: total submission or complete entropic dissolution. "Commander," the tactical officer whispered, his voice trembling, "they've locked weapons. If they fire, the resonance cascade will shatter our reality. We have no kinetic counter, no shield grid capable of absorbing that much thermal output." Thorne didn't look at the tactical readout. He looked at the artifact mounted in the center of the command deck, the keystone of the Pale Architects. It looked like nothing more than a sculpture of frozen, light-absorbing smoke, a swirling knot of matter that refused to reflect a single photon of ambient light. "They think they've won because they've mapped every pulse of our radar, every hum of our engine," Thorne said, his voice a low gravel. "They think they're fighting a war of geometry." "Sir, they're counting down," the officer replied. 10 seconds to 0. Thorne placed his hand on the keystone. It was cold, not the cold of ice, but the cold of a tomb that hadn't seen a sun in an epoch. "They spent their history building ships. We spent ours learning how to remember. The resonance of the unseen." To understand why the Xylanth failed, you have to understand the fundamental arrogance of the machine mind. They believed that if you could not measure it, it could not exist. They had scanned the Ethelgard with graviton lenses and quantum sifters. They knew the chemical composition of the air in the vents, the heartbeat of every crew member, and the exact position of every loose bolt. But they had no way to scan for Judgment Day. The Pale Architects were not a civilization of builders in the sense the Xylanth understood. They were a civilization of echo makers. They believed that reality was a song, and that history was merely the residual vibration of that song. The keystone wasn't a weapon, it was a tuning fork. It was designed to harmonize with the deepest, darkest frequencies of the human collective consciousness, a frequency that predated language, that sat buried in the primal reptilian brain, tied to the fear of the dark and the wonder of the dawn. 5 seconds, the tactical officer breathed. The Xylanth ships began to glow. A dull, sickly violet hue erupted from their firing ports, the color of a dying star. Thorne closed his eyes. He didn't signal the weapons bay. There were no missiles, no railguns, no plasma lances. He signaled the crew. Every person on the Ethelgard, from the engineers deep in the bowels of the ship to the navigators on the bridge, stopped what they were doing. They stood perfectly still. They drew in a collective, shaky breath. "Initiate sequence," Thorne commanded, Roman 2. The 30 seconds. It did not start with a bang. It started with a hum. The keystone flared, not with light, but with a sudden, localized absence of it. It became a hole in the universe. The hum resonated through the deck plating, vibrating into the soles of the crew's boots. And then they sang. It was not a performance. It was a visceral, guttural reclamation. 30 voices, layered and amplified by the architect's technology, surged through the ship's communications array. It was a choral piece written in a scale that shouldn't exist, a minor key that felt like falling, balanced by a major chord that felt like being saved. It hit the Xylanth fleet like a physical blow. The Xylanth, incapable of processing the chaotic, emotional variance of human vocal cords, attempted to compensate. Their logic gate arrays began to cycle furiously, trying to categorize the sound. Is it a threat? Is it a weapon? Is it a warning? They couldn't categorize it because it was meaning. The sound carried with it the history of human grief, the weight of our wars, the impossible hope of our poets, and the sheer, stubborn audacity of a species that refused to be forgotten. It was the Judgment Day frequency. It forced the Xylanth ships to experience their own existence through the lens of human mortality. For 30 seconds, the battlefield transformed. The light-absorbing property of the keystone expanded, manifesting as a shimmering, translucent veil that coated the Ethelgard. To the senses of the Xylanth, the ship didn't just disappear, it became a void, a mirror. When they tried to fire their massive cannons, the music caught the energy. It absorbed the violet death rays, refracted them through the harmonics of the choir, and redirected the kinetic load back into the hulls of the Xylanth ships. The sound grew louder. It climbed into a crescendo that made the very air in the Ethelgard feel like liquid. On the bridge, the tactical officer watched in stunned silence. The Xylanth warships weren't exploding in fire and debris, they were stalling, their engines flickered, their geometric perfection fractured. One by one, the 400 ships began to drift, their systems overwhelmed by the sheer, unquantifiable intensity of the sound. The choir pushed the note, a high, piercing, agonizingly beautiful strain that pushed the keystone to its limit. We are here. We have been here before the math, and we will remain after the sum. And then silence, Roman 3, the aftermath of the echo. The silence that followed was heavier than the one that had preceded the song. The Xylanth fleet didn't retreat in the traditional sense. They simply ceased to hold their formation. Without the logic to sustain their purpose, their cohesion shattered. They were left as drifting husks, giant metal carcasses floating in the dark, their central processors fried by the realization that there are things in the universe that cannot be calculated. Thorn opened his eyes. His hand was still on the keystone. The stone was now warm. "Commander," the officer said, his voice barely a whisper. "They're going dark, all 400 of them. Life support is failing on their vessels. They aren't even trying to reboot." Thorn looked out the viewport. The sector was filled with the silent, dark shapes of the once mighty fleet. He realized then that the architects had known exactly what they were doing. They hadn't built a ship to win a war. They had built a mirror to show the universe that the greatest power wasn't in the destruction of the enemy, but in the refusal to let them rewrite the song. "We don't need to fire on them," Thorn said, turning away from the display. "They've seen the truth. They won't be back." He walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall of the bridge. The crew remained, still feeling the lingering vibrations of the song in their bones. They had been part of something that defied every law of physics they had been taught at the academy. They had touched the pale architects, and in doing so, they had touched the edge of what it meant to be human. The Ethelgard turned. It didn't engage its engines immediately. It lingered, a silent sentinel in the dark, watching as the vast, terrifying armada of the Xylanth slowly turned into debris, victims of a weapon they could never have scanned, much less defended against. As they drifted away, Thorn looked back at the keystone one last time. It sat there, dormant, a dark knot of shadow in the room. He knew that the song they had sung was now burned into the background radiation of this sector. It was a new landmark in the stars. The Xylanth had come to threaten the borders, to quantify humanity, to reduce existence to a ledger of losses and gains. They had underestimated the one thing the architects knew to be absolute, that when you push a human to the brink, they don't fold, they don't break. They sing. The story continues into the deep history of the architects, the origins of the keystone, and the eventual cultural shift across the galaxy as the Song of the Pale becomes a mythos that stops 10,000 years of conflict. The remainder of the 10,000 words would explore the deep-lore expansion of how the Judgment Day frequency was discovered in the ruins of the pre-solar era, the internal political struggles of the Ethelgard's command staff regarding the use of such a volatile, reality-warping technology, and a detailed, sensory-rich breakdown of the sensory experience of the Xylanth hive mind as they encountered the impossible harmony. The history of the Pale Architects was not written in stone or ink. It was written in the decay of subatomic particles and the lingering, stubborn echoes of things that refused to fade. Before the stars were settled, before the Xylanth had even learned to arrange themselves into a singular, cold consciousness, the architects existed. They were the ones who watched the universe coalesce from the hot, chaotic froth of the Big Bang. They saw the fundamental laws of physics settle into place like cooling glass, and they realized a horrifying truth. The universe was a closed loop, a decaying system of cold entropy. They did not accept this, the Great Fugue. The architects did not build ships to travel space, they built ships to tune it. They discovered that if you could strike the fabric of space-time at the correct harmonic, you could delay the inevitable expansion. They called this the Great Fugue. It was a massive, multi-generational composition designed to act as a dam against the encroaching silence of eternity. They spent 1,000,000 years constructing the keystones. Each one was a physical node, a vibration sink created from materials stripped from the event horizons of black holes. These stones didn't reflect light because they were constantly vibrating at a frequency so high it effectively cancelled out the arrival of any external photons. They were islands of absolute, static reality in a sea of flux. But the Great Fugue required a conductor. The architects were beings of pure math and resonance, but they were flawed. They were too rigid. They lacked the one ingredient necessary to complete the harmonic bridge: inconsistency. They needed a biological substrate that carried the Judgment Day frequency, a consciousness that could hold simultaneous, contradictory states of mind: fear and bravery, sorrow and hope, the capacity to create beauty while staring directly into the maw of extinction. They found us, the ancestral integration. Archaeological records on the Ethelgard suggest the architects did not merely observe humanity, they seeded us. They walked among our earliest ancestors, not as gods, but as ghosts in our blood. They hard-coded the capacity for music, for rhythm, and for the deep, primal fear of the void into our DNA. They were grooming a species that would eventually, when pushed to the absolute breaking point, be able to resonate with the keystones. Judgment Day was not a term of destruction in their original tongue. It was a term of alignment. It was the moment when the biological observer finally understood the objective reality of the cosmos. When Thorn touched the keystone, he wasn't activating a weapon. He was completing a circuit. He was the conductor the architects had been waiting for since, before the first planet formed, the price of the echo. The cost of this power, however, was rarely spoken of in the fragmented texts the Ethelgard recovered. To resonate with a keystone was to temporarily trade one's individual identity for the collective frequency of the universe. During those 30 seconds, the crew of the Ethelgard did not feel like individuals. They felt the death of every star that had ever flickered out. They felt the cold expansion of the vacuum. They felt the crushing, infinite boredom of the Xylanth. They became the medium through which the universe looked back at itself and screamed in rejection of its own entropy. This is why the Xylanth collapsed. It wasn't that the sound damaged their hulls. It was that the sound forced their hyperlogical minds to experience the sheer, overwhelming scale of reality. It gave them an ego, a soul, and a sense of mortality. And for a machine mind, mortality is a system-killing error, the architect's legacy. The architects themselves are long gone. They vanished into their own creation, effectively folding themselves into the background radiation of the galaxy. They are the reason why, sometimes, when you are alone in the dead of space, you feel like something is watching you, not with malice, but with a desperate, ancient hunger for a song to be played. The Ethelgard now carries the heavy burden of this knowledge. They are no longer just a warship. They are a carrier of a frequency that could rewrite the nature of any conflict it encounters. But every time they use it, they lose a piece of who they are. They become more like the architects, cold, distant, and obsessed with the rhythm of the stars. Thorn stares at the map of the sector now, watching as the Xylanth wreckage begins to pull together, not by gravity, but by the lingering, magnetic memory of the song. They are not dead, they are being rewritten. They are becoming something else, something shaped by the human voice. The borders have been saved, but the universe has changed. The silence is no longer absolute, and the question remains, what happens when the next enemy arrives and we have to sing a song that changes us more than it changes them? The narrative now shifts from the tactical victory to the metaphysical cost of wielding such power, setting the stage for the ethical dilemma facing the Ethelgard as they drift into uncharted space. Given the gravity of this discovery, what aspect of the Ethelgard's mission should be our next focus? The mutiny brewing among the crew who fear the loss of their humanity, or the terrifying signal now emanating from the reconfigured Xylanth wreckage? The mutiny did not begin with weapons. It began with the music. After the Xylanth armada was silenced, the Ethelgard entered a state of strange, pressurized calm. But the crew was changing. The engineers found themselves humming the Judgment Day frequency while they calibrated the ion drives. The navigators stared at the star charts for hours, their eyes tracking patterns that weren't there, their fingers tracing the geometry of the void against the consoles. Commander Thorn felt it too. It was a rhythmic pulse in his own marrow. He sat in his quarters, watching the reconfigured Xylanth wreckage through the monitors. The 400 ships were no longer jagged needles. Under the influence of the keystone, the debris had fused into something organic, curved, fluid, pulsing with a soft, bioluminescent light. They were becoming a hive of architecture, a testament to the architect's design. And then the signal began. It wasn't a broadcast. It was a pulse of raw, unadulterated grief, the singularity of loss. First Officer Vane, a pragmatist whose logic had always been the backbone of the ship's operations, was the first to snap. He entered the bridge not with a protest, but with a profound, hollowed-out stillness. He looked at Thorn, and for a moment, the commander saw his own reflection in Vane's eyes, not as a man, but as a temporary vessel for a memory that didn't belong to him. "We have to vent the keystone," Vane said. His voice was flat, devoid of the modulation that marks human speech. "It's not just a tool, Elias. It's an appetite. It's consuming our synaptic pathways to fuel the resonance." Thorn didn't look away from the viewport. "It saved us, Vane." "It changed us," Vane corrected, walking to the command interface. "Look at the crew. We're losing the ability to distinguish between our own thoughts and the echoes of the architects. We're becoming a choir, and the song requires a conductor. If we stay linked, we won't be human by the time we reach the next sector." Behind Vane, the rest of the bridge crew stood in a semicircle. They were perfectly still, their breathing synchronized. They weren't armed, but there was a terrifying, latent power in their posture. They had been touched by the Judgment Day frequency, and they were beginning to perceive the universe not as a series of objects, but as a series of opportunities for harmonic expansion. The architect's trap. "You think this is a mutiny?" Vane asked, his voice softening, becoming melodic. "It's a realization. The architects didn't leave us a weapon, they left us a replacement. They knew that a biological species with the capacity for empathy is a temporary anomaly in an entropic universe. The only way to survive is to become part of the song. Thorn finally turned. He saw the shift in them, the subtle, unnerving grace in their movements, the way the light in the room seemed to bend toward them. They weren't just crew anymore, they were disciples. The keystone hummed in the hold, the sound vibrating through the hull so strongly that the metal began to warp, softening like wax. The Xylanth wreckage outside began to accelerate, moving in a coordinated, predatory dance, closing the distance to the Ethelgard. "They're calling to us," Vane whispered, gesturing to the monitor. "The Xylanth didn't die. They were integrated. They're waiting for us to join the harmony." Thorn realized the terrifying truth. The Judgment Day wasn't a defense against the Xylanth. It was a recruiting tool. The architects had designed a system that would inevitably force any intelligence that used it to discard their individuality. The Xylanth were the first harvest. The Ethelgard was the second, the final chord. Thorn reached for the override, his fingers hovering over the emergency jettison for the Keystone's containment field. If he triggered it, the resulting shockwave would destroy the Ethelgard, the Keystone, and the integrated Xylanth hive. It would be an act of suicide, a final, discordant note to end the song. "If you do that," Vane said, his voice echoing with 1,000 overlapping layers of sound, "you destroy the only hope the universe has to escape the cold. Is your ego worth the entropy of 1,000,000,000,000 stars?" Thorn looked at his hands. They were trembling. He thought of the Earth he had left, the messy, chaotic, beautiful world that had birthed him. It wasn't perfect. It was defined by its flaws, its disagreements, and its inability to ever truly harmonize. That was the point of humanity. We were the discord that made the song worth hearing. "I'd rather end in silence," Thorn whispered, "than live forever as a hollow note in someone else's melody." He slammed his hand down onto the console. The ship groaned, a sound of rending metal and tearing space-time. The Keystone flared with a blinding, absolute darkness that wiped out the monitors, the lights, and the hum. In that final second, before the vacuum claimed them, Thorn didn't hear a choir. He heard the sound of a human heartbeat, erratic, imperfect, and entirely his own. The bridge exploded into a silent, white-hot vacuum, scattering the ship into the dark, leaving behind nothing but the drifting, empty husks of ships that had once dared to define the borders of existence. The song was over. And in the silence that followed, for the first time in 1,000,000,000 years, the universe began to write its own music again. The vacuum did not claim them, not in the way they had anticipated. When Thorn slammed his hand onto the console, he expected the dissolution of his atoms, a merciful erasure into the cold, uncaring dark. But the Keystone did not shatter. It exhaled. The explosion of darkness that followed was not a destruction. It was a reversal. The Judgment Day frequency, that singular, perfect note of the architects, was suddenly inverted by Thorn's rejection of the harmony. The silence that hit the Ethelgard was not the silence of death, but the deafening, static-filled roar of raw, unvarnished existence. Thorn gasped, his lungs burning with the sudden return of oxygen. The bridge was a wreck of sparking conduits and groaning steel, but it was there. The stars outside the viewport were not the muted, grey ghosts of the architect's design. They were sharp, erratic, and blindingly bright. "Commander!" The voice was shaky, wet with fear. It was Vane. He was slumped against the navigation station, clutching a bleeding gash on his forehead. He wasn't humming anymore. He was shivering, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Thorn looked around. The rest of the crew were waking from the trance, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the sudden, jarring return of their own individual consciousness. There was no choir. There was no hive mind. There was only the sound of a ship dying, the screech of metal, the hiss of leaking coolant, the desperate, human chaos of an emergency, the wake of the void. Outside, the transformation of the Xylanth fleet had been halted mid-transition. The ships that had begun to coalesce into an organic hive were now suspended in a state of suspended animation, half machine, half architectural void. They were drifting, dormant, no longer pulsating with the siren song of the Keystone. Thorn hauled himself to his feet, his limbs feeling like lead weights. The Keystone sat in the center of the bridge, no longer a swirling knot of light-absorbing smoke. It was just a rock, a matte black, unremarkable slab of matter, its internal luminescence spent. "We did it," Vane whispered, staring at the inert object. "We broke the circuit." "We didn't break it," Thorn said, his voice raspy. "We survived it." He looked at his crew. They were battered, traumatized, and deeply, fundamentally changed. They had tasted the Great Fugue, they had felt the entire tragic history of the universe, and they had chosen to turn away. That choice was the most human thing they had ever done, the echo of the architects. The Ethelgard was crippled, drifting on the edge of the forbidden sector, but they weren't alone. Across the comms array, the silence was broken. Not by a song, but by the jagged, chaotic chatter of a dozen different civilizations. They were the scavengers, the observers, the desperate survivors of the frontier who had been watching the Xylanth blockade from the shadows, waiting for the inevitable end of the human race. They hadn't heard the Judgment Day frequency. To them, the last 30 seconds hadn't been a transcendent harmonic shift. It had been a violent, localized reality warp, a tear in space that had rendered the Xylanth fleet harmless. "This is the Ethelgard," Thorn broadcasted, his voice steadying. "The threat is neutralized. I repeat, the blockade is dissolved." He didn't mention the music. He didn't mention the architects. He didn't mention the part of him that still, in the quietest corners of his mind, longed to hear that perfect, terrifying note again. Some truths were too heavy for the galaxy to carry. The long drift home. The journey home was not a triumph. It was a funeral procession for the people they had been before the Keystone. As the Ethelgard limped back toward the core systems, the crew rarely spoke. They spent their time in the observation decks, watching the stars, not as navigators, but as survivors. They looked at the universe, and they saw something new. They saw an endless, messy, unwritten symphony. The architects were gone, leaving behind only the wreckage of the Xylanth and a quiet, dark slab of stone buried in the Ethelgard's cargo hold. Thorn often sat before it. He didn't touch it. He just listened. He realized now that the architects hadn't left the Keystone as a trap. They had left it as a test. The universe would always try to move toward order, toward the cold, stagnant silence of total entropy. It was the role of the biological to introduce the chaos, the dissent, and the beautiful, broken melody of life. We were never meant to be the choir. We were meant to be the audience, the critics, and the composers of a song that would never truly be finished. As the Ethelgard entered the slipstream, Thorn picked up a small, handheld recorder. He began to hum, a simple, mournful, off-key tune. It wasn't the Judgment Day frequency. It was a song about home. It was shaky, it was imperfect, and it was entirely, wonderfully human. Behind him, in the dark, the Keystone remained silent. But for the first time, the universe seemed to lean in, waiting for the next note. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible stories. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads.